In an effort to create a love child between the two worlds of Dreadful Wake and my tattooing career, I taught myself how to paint in Photoshop last month. Continuing with that theme, I wanted to flesh out some concept ideas for the three of my most iconic Dreadful Wake creatures. These were originally drawn as Flash for my tattooing, and so far I haven't found anyone crazy enough to want these permanently carved into them. But, fingers crossed. These drawings are only on 5 by 3 inch pieces of paper, so pretty big, right? I'd say they're at least average. Painting them digitally allows me to further explore far more detail than I originally had access to. And since the designs were already taken care of, I can go right into the rendering part of the process. I often try to eliminate as many variables as I can when I'm still learning a new medium, focusing on only 1 or 2 things. My brain can only handle so much. Recently, I learned how important the silhouette of a design is, and looking back at these drawings, I am surprised at how good the silhouettes look, even though that was not in the foreground of my mind when I was originally drawing them. I find it fascinating how even if you aren't fully aware of everything you are doing, if you understand so-called good design, you will likely be following pre-written rules anyways. Much like how math isn't invented, it is discovered. I'm basically a mathematician. Continuing with simplicity, I am only focusing on the value paintings for most of my painting process. This means that I only have to focus on 2 things, light and dark. Adding color during this part feels like painting values squared. Remember? Simple brain over here. There is an iterative process to my paintings. Think big to medium to small, pushing and pulling until the piece is homogeneous in detail. Zooming in on the reference images and the canvas so that the smaller details feel easier to grasp, blending and carving medium-sized shapes following the previous sketch. This process is repeated as many times as needed, usually around 3 to 4 times per painting. With traditional drawing, there is a worry of overworking the paper by constantly having to erase and redraw, making the process a little nerve-wracking. To combat this problem, I have a habit of sketching something up to 4 different times until I am fully happy with the design. Working in digital allows me to not have to think about that at all. There is a concept called destructive versus non-destructive editing. Non-destructive editing is best described as making changes that don't permanently alter the underlying work. In traditional art, almost everything is destructive. Once you put down paint or a line, you can't just press Ctrl-Z in life. If I could, I probably would have tried cocaine by now. Not having this problem is both a positive and a negative in digital art. You can make changes without ruining your work. However, if you become too used to a non-destructive workflow, it can become very difficult to transition into destructive workflows, which can often be very necessary during some parts of the process. Much like how kids who grew up with helicopter parents don't know how to complete basic functions or interact with others. They are coddled babies. Now, detail is great, of course, but where should we focus the majority of our efforts? Just like in music, there is a need for silence and slowness to emphasize the exciting parts. If every part of the song is exciting, the listener is going to get overwhelmed and tired of the monotony. The same goes for visual art in terms of detail. Breaking up value in 3 respective categories, shadows, midtones, and highlights, we probably shouldn't be putting most of our detail in the shadows, as that's where everything gets washed out by the lack of lighting. The same goes for the highlights getting washed out by too much lighting. The transitions of the opposite ends of the spectrum, or the midtones, make the most sense. That is where you get to work with both highlights and shadows and everything in between in such a small area. You can choose to pixel fuck every little part of each artwork, but then everything will either start to feel too busy, or the viewer is going to visually skip over all the detail that isn't in the transitions anyways. I've been pushing the value paintings very far into the process before I add color. I think this is mostly due to my lack of experience in color theory and painting in general. There appears to be more fidelity in color variation when I colorize my projects earlier on, and I want to attempt to transition to color sooner in future projects. But I'm not married to that idea just yet. Once I'm satisfied with the values, it is time to cut the single layer into many. I do this with the lasso tool, right-clicking and choosing Cut to New Layer. Gradient maps are then employed to automate color assignment based on the existing value data, simplifying the coloring process. Once the gradient maps are in place, there is now a base to further refine the color. This takes place both on the original layer and the extra layers on top. My most used blending modes are multiply and overlay, but the cool thing is that you can always change the blending modes during the painting process and experiment with what looks best. I highly recommend that whenever you merge your layers, before you do that, make a duplicate and throw that duplicate in a folder. My folder for this is just called Old, where all my old layers that were duplicated just get thrown into. You never know when you might want to go back a few steps. I have a habit of placing my creatures in foggy, dark backgrounds. This sets the mood and allows me to push them further away and pull them closer towards the view. It also allows me to skip over the hard part of creating said background. Adding in a proper background would have over doubled the time it takes to make these things. I have a confession. I fucking suck at backgrounds. One day I will learn, but today is not that day.